Hello, this is Michael Tracy, and here I will be giving an overview of the upcoming videos in my series on the 1996 Mount Everest disaster. These videos will take a close look at Jon Krakauer's Into Thin Air, not just as a best-selling narrative, but as a flawed and often misleading account of what really happened on the mountain. In the upcoming videos, I will further examine the key factual errors, contradictions, and narrative choices Krakauer made, and bring forward overlooked perspectives, including those of Charlotte Fox, Tim Madsen, Jaakko Namba, and the Sherpas, primarily Andorje, Norbu, and Lobsang, and all this will build a more accurate timeline of the events that took place. Jon Krakauer's Into Thin Air is by far the most popular account of the 1996 Mount Everest disaster. The book reached number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list, and by 1999 it was reported in the American Alpine Journal that it had sold over 2.5 million copies, 800,000 in hardcover and 1.76 million in paperback, and it has since been translated into over 24 languages. The story's broad appeal also earned Krakauer numerous accolades. It was named one of Time magazine's Books of the Year and became a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in General Nonfiction. It has been adopted for various academic courses, and numerous teaching guides, student notes, and book report examples can easily be found on the internet. But the problem with Into Thin Air starts with its title. First, Into Thin Air. That is a quote from Michael Groom, which appears in the 1996 Outside magazine article. As darkness fell and the storm intensified, Bidleman and 5 of Fisher's clients overtook Groom, who was bringing down Weathers on a short rope, and Namba. Beck was so hopelessly blind, Groom reports, that every 10 meters he'd take a step into thin air, and I'd have to catch him with the rope. It was bloody nerve-wracking. The irony of that should not be lost on readers, as that is about the only portion of Groom's version of events that appeared in Krakauer's 1997 book. The whole part about Groom being sick, him getting tangled in the ropes on the Hillary step, Krakauer and Namba descending together below South Summit, Groom receiving a radio call and heading back up to assist Rob Hall, only to turn back when Andorje and Norbu came down and reported on the oxygen situation. All of that completely missing, though Krakauer did admit in his 2025 chapters that Groom's account of many of those events was correct. But the bigger problem with the title is the subtitle, A Personal Account of the Mount Everest Disaster. A personal account is an eyewitness account of what that person saw, heard, and experienced, and typically in the literary context focuses on how the event impacted their own life. But Krakauer goes far beyond this, speculating, narrating events he didn't witness, and constructing his own version of timelines that turned out to be completely wrong. There is no legitimate claim that Into Thin Air is just a personal account. He reports on numerous events for which he was not there. Krakauer has an entire chapter about the deaths on the north side of the mountain when he was never there, and where he gets basic things like altitude and standard climb times completely wrong. Even on the south side, for some of the very first things he reported taking place as the teams departed South Col for their fateful climb, he was not there. He reported as fact that, quote, early in the morning, when he started short roping Pittman, Lobsang also cranked her oxygen flow as high as it would go, 4 liters per minute, and consequently she'd used up all her gas relatively quickly. Krakauer was not there for that. He departed well in advance of Pittman, and despite Pittman not running out of oxygen early in the morning, and there being no possibility that Lobsang had turned her oxygen up to 4 liters per minute at that point in time, this did not stop Krakauer reporting as fact something that he could not possibly have known, and which appears to be completely fabricated based on the simple math of oxygen flow rates. A short distance up the mountain, he reports that Doug Hansen turned around and headed down the mountain, an event that Krakauer was not there for. Krakauer then embellished the account that Doug had a, quote, brief conversation with Rob Hall, a conversation that no living person saw take place. It was just inference passed off as factual reporting in his supposedly personal account. Krakauer was not there when Mountain Madness departed South Col. He was not there when the main group of Mountain Madness reached the summit. He was not there when Mountain Madness descended the entire time, from the summit to the base of the fixed ropes, to the dog pile, to being rescued by Bukrev, roughly pages 248 to 270 in his book. Krakauer was not there for any of it, other than to note that he was in his tent and could not be roused despite Stuart Hutchinson attempting to do so. Krakauer has admitted that he got a key portion of the Mountain Madness account incorrect regarding Sandy Pittman being grabbed by the harness above the Hillary step. In 2025, Krakauer admitted that he got this wrong and blamed it on Bidleman, allegedly giving him incorrect information with no explanation as to how Krakauer managed to get it correct in his 1996 article, but completely wrong in his 1997 book. More problematic is, why would an interview of Neil Bidleman be needed at all for a book that is Krakauer's personal account of the disaster? Krakauer was not there for Rob Hall and Doug Hansen's descent, an event witnessed by Lopsong, but for which Krakauer ignored Lopsong's account and writes his own version with no explanation as to where it came from. Nor are the events Krakauer was there for on solid footing. Krakauer has already admitted he had significant false memories relating to the disaster. More problematic, he admitted that he didn't even know or even suspect these were false memories until Stuart Hutchinson told Krakauer what really happened. Krakauer has admitted fabricating the portion of his book about the Montenegrins running out of fixed ropes and has agreed to remove it from the upcoming revision to his book. Krakauer has admitted that the 1 p.m. time he reported being at the base of the Hillary Step was incorrect, but blames it on a typo. The problem with blaming it on a typo is that Krakauer claimed the book was thoroughly fact-checked. Here is Krakauer in a 2016 interview.
The anger is there. I wouldn't have written it that angry. It was, I think we fact-checked the hell out of it. It stood up.
But Krakauer gave no explanation for how the numerous items he has already agreed to fix passed this supposedly rigorous fact-checking. We also have Krakauer's statement.
My first drafts are unreadable. My 10th drafts are unreadable. I probably write every sentence in every book, you're not going to believe this, at least 100 times. And that's the beauty of writing, is you can edit it until it's as good as you can get it. No one sees that first draft, and that's a good thing.
Now, the 100 times is probably a bit of an exaggeration, but it clearly indicated that what Krakauer wrote in his book was intentional. The words on the page were deliberately crafted by Krakauer, by his own admission, 100 times for each sentence. The notion that numerous errors and fabrication were the results of sloppy writing or honest mistakes does not work when the author claims to have rewritten each sentence numerous times to get it to say exactly what he wants. That Krakauer deliberately constructed this false narrative is supported by an analysis of how Krakauer's story changed over time, from his initial candid interview immediately after the disaster to his hastily written article before he had even completed many of the critical interviews, to the final finished product that ignored those interviews and stuck to the narrative he had already created. When you listen to Krakauer in interviews and speaking presentations, he is crude, he curses, he rambles, he says half-developed theories, and gets numerous facts just plain wrong. His 1996 article was just a slight measure above all of this, but it was far from polished. Then in 1997, his book comes out and it reads like it was written by a completely different person. It is not crude. It carefully develops plot points and then offers payoffs to the reader. It develops suspense, even when we all know who dies. It is an extremely well-written book, but unfortunately, too good to be true. And that is where my criticism picks up. I am not the first person to point out the problems with Into Thin Air, nor is Into Thin Air the only book for which legitimate concerns have been raised against Krakauer. I previously mentioned Craig Medred's scathing analysis of Into the Wild, noting, quote, Krakauer in 2011 attacked Mortenson's mega best-selling book, 3 Cups of Tea, as a, quote, an intricately wrought work of fiction presented as fact. The Alaska section of Into the Wild appears to fit that description well. Medred goes on to provide numerous examples of Krakauer inventing things based on brief notes written by McCandless. Medred wrote, from the start, the author had few facts to work with. He cherry-picked some of those, ignored others, and made things up to fill in the gaps between the few words. Medred would not be the last person to contend that Krakauer presented things as fact that were not, and then cherry-picked evidence to support his narrative. Similar criticism of Krakauer was leveled by author Heidi Hawkins Lockwood, who was upset that Krakauer was invited to address a Title IX sexual assault conference, Title IX referring to the federal statute regarding gender discrimination in education. As a note, the article was posted to Medium by Kate O'Hear, but it is reposting Lockwood's article. Lockwood is a philosophy professor who bills herself as a feminist philosopher. Here is her critique of Krakauer's work. Third, Krakauer is neither an expert on Title IX nor a journalist. He has made a living flipping from one subject to another, writing books on diverse topics that intentionally target specific individuals or groups. Granted, he unabashedly takes on sensitive topics with sensational appeal, but instead of presenting thorough research on each subject, he cherry-picks facts to create narratives that are textbook cases of bad journalism. narratives constructed by deliberately avoiding details that contradict his story and that are pieced together with little regard for universally accepted journalistic ethics, such as reaching out to those whose reputations will be decimated by the story or refraining from providing payment for information. And of course, there is Julie Rock's criticism in False Summit, which I have discussed previously, Krakauer's extensive biases, not reporting what people told him, and promoting his narrative over objective journalism. The common theme of all of these is that Krakauer prioritized narrative over objective reporting, and he cherry-picked evidence to support that narrative. This should come as no surprise, as Krakauer admitted to doing this in an extended interview that appeared in the book The New Journalism, published in 2007. Here's Krakauer. How would you describe your reportorial stance? I try hard to be fair and objective, but if I care enough about a subject to write about it, I tend to have an agenda. There's almost always a case I'm trying to make, though I usually prefer to present it indirectly rather than beat the readers over the head with it. Earlier, I'm a storyteller. I need a narrative chassis on which to assemble my ideas. If I determine that a potential story is sufficiently fertile and decide to go for it, I commence a feverish hunt for material that will drive the narrative forward while simultaneously illustrating the points I wish to make. That is the very definition of cherry-picking, searching for material that will drive your narrative forward rather than driving the narrative with the material that has been uncovered. But Krakauer frequently says things that he later regrets or wants to alter. Don't take my word for it, Krakauer says so himself. I mean, hell, when I've been on the other end of the relationship, when journalists have interviewed me during my book tours, I've said things that came back to bite me in the ass. When someone sticks a microphone in our face, we are afflicted with this inexplicable compulsion to tell all. It is easy enough to see this in his 2016 presentation when Krakauer blurted out that the oxygen was stolen, a rather important fact that somehow had gone unmentioned in his book about people running out of oxygen. We see it in a quote from the reporter in the True Nature of Journalism article, where Krakauer reportedly admitted that he, quote, publicly falsified the story of Into Thin Air. In his 2025 chapter, Krakauer denies ever having said that, though he offers no explanation as to why the reporter would have written it. To the newspaper's credit, they have not issued a retraction or correction to that story. Krakauer's devoted fans are keen to point out that the reporter, Becca Stein, was a college student at the time. Apparently, they have not gotten around to reading Krakauer's book Missoula, which is about female college students making allegations that are vehemently denied by others. When I first started the 1996 series, I had noted some inconsistencies in Krakauer's account, but there are inconsistencies in any account. More problematic was that various YouTube content creators were taking the worst aspects of Krakauer's book and amplifying them. As I delved into the issue, the more apparent it became that there were serious problems with Krakauer's book. It was not simply memories at altitude. It was deliberate falsification and bias. But at a basic level, I view reporting or telling stories about what happened on the mountain fundamentally different from Krakauer. While he states a narrative and then tries to find facts to fit it, and even invents them when he can't find them, I develop the narrative around the facts. And as new facts come out, sometimes the narrative has to change. I also view the 1996 disaster as containing many stories from people who have been overlooked in the relentless push for a compelling narrative and search for heroes and villains. I'll explore these in some upcoming videos, but I want to outline some of the key stories I plan on telling. There is Charlotte Fox's story, which highlights basic human decency. In her American Alpine Journal article, Fox wrote, quote, "A bunch of people went climbing, each with his or her own reasons. There were no heroes or villains." Now, of course, Fox's account is significantly different from Krakauer's at a factual level. They waited on oxygen, not fixed ropes. She was told to wait at the summit, and numerous people contributed to getting people down the mountain, even though they were clients and not guides. Even on the small points, Fox's story is more accurate than Krakauer's. For instance, she gets the phase of the moon correct, an easily verifiable fact that Krakauer got wrong. And at a high level, Fox's story is completely opposite to Krakauer's narrative that it was a bunch of greedy, self-serving rich people who paid to be carried up the mountain. There's Tim Madsen's story, as told by Neil Bidleman in the transcript. Tim was a client, not a guide, and he greatly helped get people down the mountain. Bidleman noted, "I believe Tim helped me several times in picking her up, throwing her, pushing her, pulling her, something to that effect, over some of those crevasses." There, Bidleman is referring to Yasko Namba, who who was not even on their team. And I'll cover Yasko Namba's story. It is very different from the version in Into Thin Air. She was fighting much harder, and we can finally piece together most of her descent. Of note is that in Krakauer's 2025 chapter, he provides detailed quotes from his interview with Michael Groom that now completely undermine the narrative in Into Thin Air. Of course, Groom did not send Namba down so he could look for his camera case. I'll cover exactly what happened in the video. Most importantly, Groom confirms an account from Martin Adams that had Yasko glyzating down the gully below the balcony. When I made the first Namba video, I excluded this. It was just an unconfirmed statement by Adams that Bucrev had speculated was referring to Namba, not enough to go with. But with the confirmation from Groom that this was Namba glyzating, we can now piece together Namba's descent and see that she was fighting much harder than was previously thought. Fortunately, in his 2025 chapter, Krakauer wrote, quote, "It's reasonable for people to wonder if I'm responsible for the death of Yasko Namba. That is a rare point of agreement between myself and Krakauer. I will cover Yasko's story and address that issue. Not surprisingly, my analysis is very different than Krakauer's. When I made the original Namba video, it did not take into account the impact of the stolen oxygen and how little Yasko Namba actually received at South Summit. As I changed my narratives to reflect the facts, I took the video down as it did not reflect a major fact about Namba's descent. I'll have a new video that goes through Namba's descent, how her oxygen was stolen, how she ran out at the bottom of the gully and then got lost on her way to the fixed ropes, how she eventually made it to the fixed ropes, where she was assisted by Neil Bidleman and Tim Madsen, who was a client, not a guide. And then that picks up at the next major story that still needs to be told. And that is Bidleman's choice. This covers the decision made by Neil Bidleman to deviate from the straight line descent into camp. This will highlight some of Bidleman's decision-making and how he proactively addressed the various problems that came up on the climb. Whether you agree or disagree with his decision, it will look at the consequences of that decision and how it shaped the events on South Col. And there are also the stories of the climbers who turned around below South Summit: Lou Koschitzky, John Taskey, and Stuart Hutchison. I had previously looked at the factual differences between Koschitzky's account and Krakauer's, but that is not the core of Koschitzky's story that needs to be told. Koschitzky was an experienced climber who had made a deal with his wife. He would get one and only one chance to climb Mount Everest. As such, Koschitzky researched the best options and decided on Rob Hall's team because he thought it would give him his best chance. Unfortunately, Rob Hall's team was stretched thin on oxygen and oxygen equipment, and they did not have a backup regulator on the summit day. Koschitzky's regulator was broken, and he was essentially climbing without oxygen. Had Rob Hall had a backup regulator, Koschitzky likely would have made the summit. But Koschitzky paid for a Cadillac Expedition, only to get a Ford Pinto. I'll tell his story because it is one that Koschitzky cannot tell. If he did, it would come across as him complaining and blaming Rob Hall for his own failure. It is a similar story for John Taskey and Stuart Hutchison. Hutchison made valiant attempts to assist, but ultimately, by himself, he could not do much. So the narrative is that all these climbers were just inexperienced, couldn't deal with the problems as soon as the storm hit. John Taskey and Lou Koschitzky just stayed in their tents. But why? Simple. Their oxygen was taken. Not stolen. Taken by Rob Hall. They paid for 3 bottles, which would have lasted 18 hours and gotten them back to camp in good shape. But when they turned around, Rob did not send their oxygen down with them. He repurposed it to push Doug Hansen and Yasko Namba to the summit. Taskey, Hutchison, and Koschitzky would run out of oxygen on their descent, and they had to descend from well above the balcony without oxygen. Koschitzky never really had his oxygen working at all, so his entire climb was essentially without oxygen. Rob Hall had stretched his oxygen too thin because of a last-minute addition to the team of a non-cash-paying client. Rob Hall's clients had paid for an expedition that was supposed to give them the best chance of reaching the summit. Instead, they ended up paying for a bunch of discounted future advertising in Outside magazine. This left them without oxygen for several hours on the descent. Not surprisingly, they were in no condition to assist others. Had they simply been provided the oxygen they had paid for, likely a rescue party could have been put together. And then there is Doug Hansen's story, which looks like he did not make the actual summit. I know some viewers felt that they really wanted Doug to have reached the summit, and that somehow that summit defined Doug's climb. But that is not what Doug Hansen is primarily known for. If you browse the internet, there are numerous people blaming Doug Hansen for Rob Hall's death. These people are not trolls. They are not haters. They are just stating the rather obvious conclusions from the false narrative that they have been fed for the past 29 years. Doug Hansen's story is that he definitely turned around early in the morning and made the decision to give up on his Everest dream and head back to safety. It also appears he turned around below the summit. Rather than being a story about inexperienced climbers causing the guides to die trying to rescue them, we see an all too familiar pattern of experienced climbers leading far less experienced people to their deaths. This is a well-known story in this channel. George Mallory led the 7 Sherpa to their deaths in 1922, and he led the far less experienced Andrew Irvin to his death in 1924. We also have Goran Kropp's story, which is key to understanding things because technically, Doug Hansen, Lou Kosiski, and an unnamed third climber were actually on Goran's permit. Contrary to what Krakauer wrote in Into Thin Air, in 1996 there was a limit of a total of 12 people on any one expedition. It is not clear if the limit of 12 included Western Base Camp personnel, but if it did, then Hall was using Goran's permit to get around the limit on expedition size. But even if the expedition limit of 12 only applied to Western climbers who would attempt the summit, Hall and Kropp's scheme still resulted in $30,000 less in total permit fees being paid to the Nepalese government. Not sure how a hard-hitting investigative journalist missed that one. Getting back to Goran's account, he also fills in with a little more of the gossip. Given the extensive time Krakauer spent on Sandy Pittman's personal life, it's surprising he left out this little bit. Bob Pittman, Sandy Future's ex-husband and co-founder of MTV, was involved in a new romance with the younger designer Veronique Koa. Up until very recently, she had been married to David Bershears. So David and Sandy had been united by each having been jilted for the other's spouse. Of course, Krakauer was not above tabloid journalism, including the parts about Pittman hooking up with a snowboarder, but a piece that might humanize Pittman even just a little bit, well, you have to draw the line somewhere. Then there was Goran's climb itself, an oxygenless summit, and he did not even use the fixed ladders and ropes on the lower ice fall on the ascent, though he did use them on the descent. Goran's climb was the type that Krakauer claimed did not exist on Everest. Here is Goran doing the type of ice climbing Krakauer lamented was absent from Everest. It is odd that Krakauer didn't report this, especially given that there is a 1 in 6 chance that Krakauer was actually on Goran's expedition permit. There's also the story of the numerous Sherpa who Krakauer deleted from his account. It started with the little things, like this passage where in the 1996 article, Krakauer mentions that the tea was delivered to the tent by the Sherpa, and while Krakauer devotes 5 pages to Sandy Pittman's social life and marriage in his 1997 book, apparently the 8 words about the Sherpas delivering the tea, that needed to be cut. But if you read Mike Groom's book, you know he described the system that the Sherpa used to deliver the tea to the climbers at South Col, as Groom clearly thought it was relevant. Also deleted was Lopsong anchoring the final section of the route with his ice axe, and Dorje and Norbu trying to get Doug to descend, and of course Dorje and Norbu being in front of Krakauer on the descent from the balcony. And of course there are the numerous mistakes relating to which Sherpa summited, some of which Krakauer has already admitted that are mistakes and has agreed to fix in his upcoming book. Ultimately, in my version of events, oxygen bottles and Sherpa support are the keys to understanding how the disaster unfolded. Well, we have this information from the Mountain Madness team because it was put together and accurately reported by Anatoly Bukrev. For the Adventure Consultants team, we do not know how many Sherpa headed out of South Col, if any of them turned around early, nor how much oxygen each one was carrying. Of course, everyone pays lip service to the Sherpa and says how much they appreciate them and all this stuff, but I look at what people do and not what they say. And when a journalist systematically ignores the Sherpa, and did not even interview them about the key elements of the climb, it is not a surprise that such a journalist does not have a remotely accurate picture of what happened. And of course, for the Sherpa, there is Lopsong's story. A frequent myth is that Lopsong and Dorje were the two who were supposed to set out in advance to fix the rope, but that was the factually incorrect version of events portrayed by Krakauer in his 1996 article, which he subsequently very subtly changed in his 1997 book. In 2025, in the comments section, he confirmed that the 1997 version is correct, and other survivors also confirm this version. That version is that a total of 4 Sherpa were planned to set out in advance, 2 from each team. But that destroys the myth that Lopsong being tired or sick or slow or short roping someone caused any problems. According to Lopsong, the reason the fourth Sherpa didn't head out in advance as planned is because the two leaders, Rob and Scott, abandoned that plan. But if Rob Hall had wanted to stick to that plan, he could have sent his own two Sherpa in advance at any point. Indeed, Luke Koschitzky's version is that Rob Hall had planned to send his own two Sherpas out with no mention of anything to do with Mountain Madness. He planned to send our two strongest Sherpa 1 hour ahead of the rest of us to do the work, just in case it wasn't done. But for some reason, people want to blame Lopsong, so this myth persists despite Krakauer having confirmed his 1996 version was false. On the other side of the mountain, there's Hans Kammerlander's story. He was on the north side and did a ski descent. There was a distinct possibility he descended the area between the second and third steps by removing his skis and climbing down the area that I referred to as the zigzag route. We will see what comes up with further investigation about exactly how Kammerlander managed to descend. And of course, there is John Krakauer's story. One of the problems with altitude is that some people develop false memories. Krakauer has already admitted to significant false memories about what happened in 1996, and in this 2016 interview, it appears he had formed yet another false memory about what happened at South Summit on the descent.
Rob Hall was in trouble then. Doug Hansen, we were coming down, Andy and I, at the South Summit. 300 feet above, Rob was on the summit with Andy, and he collapsed. And as I was starting to head down, before we even knew there was a storm, Rob radioed Andy and said, "Doug's in trouble, he's collapsed. I need you to bring oxygen and come back up." There's oxygen on the South Summit. And Andy then said, they said, "Send Krakauer down, you need to come back up." And Andy went back up with oxygen.
No, that never happened. At no point was there a radio call while Krakauer was at South Summit, nor did Andy or anyone else say to send Krakauer down. So I'll tell Krakauer's story, the one that is supported by the evidence, even if Krakauer doesn't remember it that way. There's also Bukrev's story, which he did document in the climb. However, Bukrev's version is also not without its faults. And while I have not found the pervasive narrative shaping and fabrication of events that appears in other accounts, I will point out a major issue I have with Bukrev's version, and that is his 6:30 p.m. time of reascending. Sometime about 6 p.m., I understood I needed to go up, so I began my preparations, and by 6:30 I was out of my tent getting into my crampons. The weather was deteriorating above me, but at the South Col it was still okay, stronger increasing winds, but okay. That time is not remotely accurate, as he would have ran into Andorje, Norbu, Krakauer, and Adams on their descent. Krakauer places the time at about 7:30, and it is a rare example of Krakauer being more accurate than Bukrev. Bukrev's account has some additional information which related to the stunt. I am equally critical of Bukrev for not mentioning the stunt, and I will look at how it impacted the climb, and that Scott Fisher chose to have all the clients ascend on the same day, something the clients did not want to do because not all of them had finished their acclimatization rotations. No one wants to talk about that stunt. I understand why, but it remains a key part of the story. Then there is Graham Ratcliffe's story, documented in A Day to Die For. I'll cover the issue with the weather reports, but more from an eye of being able to spot sensationalized claims and how to sift out what is legitimate. But there is one story that is not part of the narrative, and that is my story. I was not there. I did not witness any of these events. What my videos do is point out the sources and provide an easy way for you to verify what they say by producing the sources directly on the screen. I do not know that Rob Hall's turnaround time was 1 p.m. How could I possibly know that? I was not there. I point out that Luke Koschitzky, Michael Groom, and Stuart Hutchinson all say it was 1 p.m. I cite Koschitzky's account that it could not possibly have been 2 p.m. based on the math of how much oxygen was being used. I do not know if the delays were caused by people waiting on Rob Hall's go-ahead to proceed. I was not there. I point you to Michael Groom's account, where he said he wanted to go ahead and fix the ropes, but he instead chose to follow Rob Hall's instructions and to wait. I point you to Charlotte Fox's account, where she says they waited on the oxygen. I was not there at the base of the Hillary Step at 1 p.m. Instead, I point you to this photo and show the climbers proceeding normally. I then point you to Lena Gamelgard's account, where she notes Jasko Namba took more than 30 minutes to scale the Hillary Step, which would explain all the delays at that location. I was not there at the balcony when Michael Groom saw John Krakauer and Jasko Namba descending. I simply point you to Michael Groom's account, where he says that is what he saw. So why do I tell these stories? These people have written their books, and you can read them just as well as I can. But perhaps there are people who do not wish to spend the time to read over a dozen different books, cross-reference photos, and compile their own timeline as to what happened. Ultimately, my interest is best explained in this quote from Tenzing Norgay, where he's answering whether he or Hillary were the first to reach the summit. I've thought much about what I will say now, of how Hillary and I reached the summit of Everest. Later, when we came down from the mountain, there was much foolish talk about who got there first. Some say that only one of us got there, or neither. Still others that one of us had to drag the other up. All this is nonsense. And all over the world, I'm asked, who got there first? Who got there first? Again, I say, this is a foolish question. The answer means nothing. And it is a question that has been asked so often, that has caused so much talk and doubt and misunderstanding, that I feel after long thought that the answer should be given. As will be clear, it is not for my own sake that I give it, nor is it for Hillary's. It is for the sake of Everest, the prestige of Everest, for generations who will come after us. Why, they will say, should there be a mystery to this thing? Is there something to be ashamed of, to be hidden? Why can we not know the truth? Very well. Now they will know the truth. Everest is too great, too precious, for anything but the truth. There is a truth of what happened in 1996. It is nothing personal, and these videos are about finding out what that truth is.